Anyway, tonight we have a topic that I have admired from afar but know absolutely nothing about. Extinction Rebellion. Did I get it right? It's on Thursday, ECAN, or is it tomorrow? Thursday, ECAN are declaring, are approving it. And so we can thank Cynthia and a number of others there for doing their bit behind the scenes. And so I just ask you to welcome Jackie, and it's over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, so my name is Jackie Barnes. I'm with Extinction Rebellion in Christchurch. Let's see, where do I start? Grew up on a farm, Southland girl. Thank you. Ended up over in London for 20 odd years. Bought a house over there. Got into gardening as you do, having grown up on the farm. I got stuck into the vegetable garden, ended up with an allotment, got involved in the organic movement. There you couldn't really avoid actually knowing anything about climate change. It was just in your face with the organic movement, and just continued to read up on it, get myself familiar with it, just keep getting worse. And in 2012 I took the decision actually to move back to New Zealand from the UK purely for climate change reasons. It was not looking good. I mean, UK's got about 9 days worth of food, and that is it. So any disruption to its distribution lines is pretty severe. So now that having shared a little bit about myself, I'd just like to take a minute for you actually just to turn to someone you don't really know that well. I know you're here on a regular basis, but just talk to them about why you're actually here to listen to this particular talk on climate change ecological.
Hi, I'm Rose.
Okay, thanks very much. I don't think I've ever heard such a buzz, so well done. Okay, so let's talk in many forms has been given around the world, literally hundreds of times now. The first part of the talk, we're actually going to look at the actual science, climate science, and a lot of you will be familiar with this. The second part of the talk, we're actually going to look at a roadmap for action through Extinction Rebellion. Part two, what to do, responses. Okay, the talk is going to take 45-50 minutes, and the basic premise of the talk is to tell the truth and then to act on it. The truth is scary, particularly when you put it all together in one place. And this may cause sort of quite strong emotions during this first part of the talk. Sadness, anger, grief, fear. But those are all perfectly natural responses to this topic. And just allow yourselves to actually just feel those. All of us have been through it in Extinction Rebellion. We're still going through it. We have our bad days, we have our good days. But I do want to emphasise that we're not helpless and we're not powerless. And that when we actually can connect together and join together, we do have a lot of power. And we do have some control over our destiny to actually change things. So when we're talking about climate change, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a good place to start. Who's actually heard of the IPCC? Yep. Whoa. I think that's probably the most I've seen so far. Just a quick overview then. They were created in 1988 by the UN. They're a body of scientists and diplomats and they provide governments with scientific information to develop the individual government's climate policies. And since 1988, there have been 5 comprehensive reports. The reports are always cautious and conservative due to this particular lengthy consensus approach. However, in October last year, the IPCC changed their tone. They released a special report and gave us 12 years to avoid catastrophic climate change. It was a shocking report for many people, and it did receive massive global coverage. And some newspaper headlines were screaming 12 years until we're doomed. The executive director of the UN Environment Programme said it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. And yet, despite the drastic language, the report was still criticised by some in the scientific community for not expressing the true scale of the climate crisis. The document was, for example, called incredibly conservative by Bob Ward of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change, because it did not mention the likely rise in climate-driven refugees or the danger of tipping points that could push the world onto an irreversible path of extreme warming. So the report may say that keeping global average temperature rise below 1.5 degrees can be done, but that does rely heavily on negative emission technologies, which involves the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, and this has been most famously criticised by Professor Kevin Anderson. The technology that's mentioned most often is called BECCS, B-E-C-C-S. Stands for Biomass Energy with Carbon Capture and Storage. By that you grow trees and plants which suck CO2 out of the atmosphere as they grow. You then chop them down and transport them around the world to be burnt in power stations, capturing the CO2, which you then liquefy and pump through pipelines a few hundred kilometres away, where it is stored underground, under pressure, and will hopefully stay for a few thousand years. And that's what we're relying on in every single model advising governments. It's extremely expensive, it's cripplingly inefficient as yet, never worked at scale as yet anywhere in the world. And yet the IPCC Mitigation Group advises policymakers around the globe to decrease their emissions minimally and offload the burden to the next generation, who are supposed to invent the technology to do this at scale around the world. And in regards to the IPCC special report, including those technologies, Professor Schullenhuber, who's a senior advisor to Pope Francis and the EU, says climate change is now reaching the end game, where very soon humanity must choose between taking unprecedented action or accepting that it has been left too late and bear the consequences. The issue is the very survival of our civilization. Now, the IPCC report says we must aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, but we are already at a global average of 1.1 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels. And then we've got to bear in mind the difference between the ice ages and the interglacial periods was 4 degrees C. Also, over the last 11,000 years since the dawn of human civilization, the temperature has never varied between plus or minus 0.4 degrees C. And 1.1 degree is actually an average. The Arctic has actually increased by 2.3 degrees since the 1970s. It is also important to note that certain temperature increases are already locked in. There are unavoidable increases caused by past activity. First one is the aerosol masking effect. It's also called global dimming, where pollution from burning fossil fuels constantly shields the Earth from more warming. The moment we stop polluting, the particles settle and the temperature will rapidly increase and is expected to heat the Earth about 0.5 degrees C. It's a one-off event, but that sudden rise in temperature could have catastrophic consequences. And the time lag could be described as a moving car, which if put in neutral continues to go forward. The temperature increases do not magically stop the second that emissions stop. And the lag has been calculated to be about 10 years. And so we're looking at least another 0.2 degrees C, which is what has been the rise in the last 10 years. However, bear in mind that emissions keep rising and have done at least for the last couple of years. And that takes us up to 1.8 degrees C at least. And you may have noted in the news on climate change the focus on what is happening in the Arctic. And that's because what happens in the Arctic is hugely important. And ice is our planetary air conditioning system. You lose the ice, and there are consequences due to two effects: the latent heat effect and the ice albedo effect. So normally when you apply heat to a substance, its temperature will increase. But that's not the case while a phase change is occurring, like ice to water or water to steam. And applied to the Arctic, this means that as long as there's ice, the heating energy from the sun and the atmosphere just goes into melting ice, and the temperature rise does not increase. And 80 kilocalories just happens to be the amount of energy needed to melt 1 kilogram of ice. And the same amount of energy applied to water increases the water temperature to 80 degrees C. So once there's no ice in the Arctic, the water temperature and with it the air temperature of the whole system will skyrocket. Like a white t-shirt or a white roof, the white ice reflects heat. Dark ocean absorbs heat and in turn melts more ice. So it's a system that feeds into itself, and it's called a feedback loop. And it's a vicious circle that accelerates exponentially. The actual data on the melting of the Arctic sea ice suggests the Arctic will actually be ice-free for the first time in more than 2 million years, sometime in the next 5 years. It's called a blue ocean event. It may only be for a week or 3 in the first year, but that ice-free time period will grow. One of the most eminent climate scientists in the world, Peter Wadhams, believes an ice-free Arctic could add as much as 50% to the direct global heating effect of CO2. And the consequences of a blue ocean event are numerous and devastating. And there are tipping points beyond which a significant and often unstoppable effect or a change takes place. For the Arctic, we're past the tipping point of stopping the ice loss. In the Antarctic, if we continue with the current rate of emissions, ice shelves all across West Antarctica could collapse within decades. After that, it'll probably just be a matter of time before the land-based glaciers collapse as well. Other blue ocean event consequences include the accelerated melt of Greenland, water vapour increases, and you can think of the recent West Coast flooding and also Mozambique. They're a direct result of the water vapour increase. And I just keep thinking, that lady that drowned over on the West Coast, if we hadn't had climate change, flooding would have probably still happened, but it would not have been as devastating. She might actually be alive today because of it. Other consequences are the jet stream disruption, and that's caused the abnormal weather patterns in the northern hemisphere that we know about from news, hopefully, polar vortex, and amongst many other consequences. The Amazon rainforest in Brazil, one of the world's largest carbon sinks, and it's lost an area about 3 times the size of New Zealand to deforestation since 1970. And in combination with a warming climate, that means there is less and less water that transpires from the soil into the air via the trees. That means less rain, means less growth, an extended dry season, leading to more and more forest fires. And the tipping point for the Amazon expected to be around 3 degrees warming, and where the forest will transform into a savanna landscape. Canada's boreal forests are now net emitters due to drought, pests, disease, and fire. And they have been since about 2001. And that's why people are calling it a climate emergency. We are facing actually a hothouse Earth. A 2018 paper by the National Academy of Sciences in the US addressed the threat of abrupt climate change, when changes happen very quickly and become essentially irreversible due to runaway effects. It points out that the Earth has never had a quasi-stable state that is around 2 degrees C, warmer than pre-industrial. There is a substantial risk that temperatures will keep rising due to feedback loops until it reaches a new equilibrium, much higher than 2 degrees. About 10 feedback loops were studied, although more are being discovered as more effort is being made to understand Earth's interconnected systems. An example is the loss of Greenland ice, which could disrupt the Gulf Stream ocean current, which would raise sea levels, but also it accumulates heat in the Southern Ocean, which would in turn then accelerate ice loss from East Antarctica. And currently the Gulf Stream is at its weakest level that it's ever been. Well, not ever been, for the last 1600 years. Global food security will be severely impacted, and crops will fail on a more regular basis. Many areas will cease to produce food at all due to flooding or desertification. It brings the question to mind, what happens to society when food prices spike? Anyone got a one-word answer for that? Absolutely. You can think of Syria, the Arab Spring, and Ethiopia, where we saw riots, mass starvation, and the breakdown of society. Rising temperatures causing land ice on Greenland and Antarctica to melt will cause rising sea levels. And this map shows the populations at risk of that resultant flooding. Many cities are based on rivers or on coasts. Some are going to be gone forever, and others are going to be sustaining vast damage and destruction. In 2016, a report identified 18,000 Christchurch properties at risk to sea level rise. And that's compared to 10,000 homes that were destroyed in the Christchurch earthquakes. Estimates do suggest several metres over the next 50 to 100 years. However, I know there's a report out that correlates our current CO2 levels to what sea level was in the past. At our current levels, it was about 20 metres. That was over a lot longer time. This is a lot quicker, and just needs time to catch up. So pretty much we're already baked in 20 metres worth of sea level rise. That's Christchurch gone. Botanic Gardens weather station there, I know, is at 7 metres. And actually a quote from an article on the 22nd of April of Harold Wanless, Director of University of Miami's Geological Sciences Department and a leading expert on sea level rise, and studied the rate at which oceans have risen and retreated over millennia. He fears that a variety of feedback loops will contribute to a dramatic increase in sea level in the coming decades. My work on ancient climate shows we have these rapid pulses of rise that are rather dramatic, up to 10 metres of sea level rise, certainly within a century. And that's a really rapid disintegration of ice. We're just seeing the beginning of ice melt and the beginning of the warming of the waters reaching up to the Arctic. And what is most certainly going to be the beginning of one of these rapid pulses. So sea level rise will cause and is already causing people to migrate. And the World Bank, which is a conservative organisation, suggests 140 million people could be on the move from climate change by 2050, and potentially 2 billion by the end of the century. And this won't be only from sea level rises, but from losing water and agricultural resources. And it won't be just between countries, but within countries. Now we can think of Ecuador, Honduras, Guatemala, and the caravan that has been hitting the US. A lot of those people, they cannot grow food anymore. And it may only impact us because Honduras is losing its coffee growing capacity. But for them it's a livelihood, and it's food, and it's starvation. Then there are many other pressures on Earth's ecology. Oceans, even more than forests, are the lungs of the Earth. They produce between 50 to 80% of Earth's oxygen and consume more than a quarter of the planet's carbon dioxide. But it is reliant on a thriving marine ecosystem. Ocean acidification is known as the evil twin of global warming. And that acidity is increased by about 30% already, and it's set to increase by 150% by 2100. And 20% of humans rely on marine life for nutrition, and some marine creatures, like some species of ocean producing phytoplankton, are unable to survive in an acidic ocean. And without them, the marine food chain will collapse. Climate change and pollution are inextricably linked. Some types of air pollution, especially black carbon and methane, are among the top contributors to global warming after CO2. And in the ocean, pesticide and fertilizer runoff are creating huge dead zones. And these are ocean depleted zones where many marine species struggle to survive or just don't. The world's largest dead zone, located in the Gulf of Mexico, is around 23,000 square kilometres, which is roughly the size of Israel. And the current global count of dead zones is 400. And soil erosion. New Zealand loses soil actually 10 times faster than the rest of the world, mainly due to our land management practices of forest clearance and overstocking on steep terrain. And deforestation and habitat loss are also massive blows to our planet's ability to regulate its temperature, as well as, of course, to its wildlife. And so to the issue of actual extinction. There have been 5 mass extinctions that scientists can see in the geological record. The last one, that killed the dinosaurs, was caused, at least partly, by an asteroid strike. The other 4 were all rapid increases in atmospheric CO2. They were triggered, for example, by huge volcanic eruptions, which in turn set peat or coal seams alight for decades, for hundreds of years. The most devastating extinction event to date was actually the Permian-Triassic extinction. And 97% of all life was lost. And it was due to runaway feedback loops, events that lead to the gassing of the planet. The rate of CO2 emissions then actually mirrors that now, except we're doing it a lot faster. So we know that human extinction is a possibility on our current business as usual path. That's methane being released already from the sea. And actually that's just methane. It's risen in the last couple of years. They're investigating why. They're not too sure why. It had plateaued for a little bit for a few years. Now starting to increase again. They think it's actually from peatlands and lakes areas up near the Arctic Circle, which obviously with the warming is just starting to erupt. The other one that we need to keep an eye on is nitrous oxide. It is hugely, hugely potent. And a latest report has actually found that it's about 12 times as much as what they previously thought was coming out. And then we have already entered the 6th mass species extinction. Since 1970, we've lost 60% of all our wildlife. I think our wildlife accounts for about 4% of animals now. The rest is domestic. On the 6th of May, a global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services was released. It shows 1 million species at risk of extinction, with causes deforestation, overfishing, hunting, poaching, pollution, invasion by exotic species, and climate change. The species endangered include about 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, 1/3 of amphibians, and about 70% of all plants. Most of us will know of the recent Environment Aotearoa report, which was released. It's just showing the world how bad we are at actually caring for our own home. We have the highest proportion of threatened indigenous species in the world. And that includes about 90% of all seabirds, 84% of reptiles, 76% of freshwater fish, and 74% of terrestrial birds at high risk, all threatened with extinction. This is a slide actually from that report, and it shows the issues. One, that our ecosystems and biodiversity are under threat. And we have 4,000 species currently classified as threatened or at risk. How we use our land is reducing land available for natives and degrading the water and soil. Pollution from our activities in both urban and rural environments is a major problem. Freshwater and marine resources are being misused. And climate change is just intensifying all of these. Extinct. Professor Jim Bendell produced a paper last year called Deep Adaptation, in which he summarises that animal and plant extinction is already happening on a vast scale. Societal collapse is inevitable and soon, maybe in as little as 3 years. The massive loss of human life is very likely, and human extinction is possible. This really should be on the news every night, discussions and stories of what we're doing, but it's not. It's as if, it should be as if we're involved in a world war, but it's worse than a world war. So that's actually the end of the intense and scary part, and it is pretty heavy. But I do want to share some words from a Dr. Kate Marvell, who researches humanity's effect on climate. She's with NASA, and what we can expect in the future. And she says the opposite of hope is not despair, it is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. And here the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together. The swiftness of the change, its scale and inevitability binds us into one. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness, and are not worth the less for it. Courage is the resolve to do well, without the assurance of a happy ending. So I just want to take a minute, just let that just absorb. Now I want to take a couple of minutes, and if you can turn to someone else that you don't know very well, or you're uncomfortable with someone you do, and just discuss feelings that this part of the talk has actually arisen for you. So thanks for sharing, and I hope if there are any sort of strong feelings that you can take some comfort in knowing that you're not alone here. I mean, I keep myself updated on what reports are coming through, the latest bad news, and normally if there's a particularly heavy one, like the global assessment report that just came through last week, then yeah, I'm in tears again, yet again. It's just a continual process. So how do we respond to this crisis? So first, what has been our political response to the emergency? So globally, up until very recently, there has been a distinct lack of concrete action. In 1990, the UN warned that climate change was happening and stated that if we did not keep global temperature increases below 1 degree C, then there would be societal collapse around the world. And since then, carbon emissions have increased by 60%, and we are now close to 1.2 degrees C. There was great rejoicing when the Paris Agreement was reached in 2015. It commits all countries to take self-imposed action to reduce emissions and then regularly update that commitment in order to keep temperature increases well below 2 degrees, ideally below 1.5. And the current commitments by countries point to about 3 degrees C at least by the end of the century. The forecasts are between 3 and 6 degrees. Obviously way off target. And New Zealand's responses has been a mixed bag. On one hand, last year, the government has seen some exciting action when they committed to no new offshore gas and oil exploration. Yay. Great, apart from the fact that current permits don't expire until 2050. And permits are still being offered for onshore exploration. Under Labour's coalition agreement with New Zealand First, if the agricultural sector is introduced to the emissions trading scheme, it'll be given a 95% free allocation. Not a great incentive to reduce the 49% of country's total emissions that come from agriculture. And the $1 billion Taranaki 8 Rivers urea plant that has been celebrated as a climate solution both continues to justify gas exploration as well as supporting ecological harmful farming practices using urea fertiliser. And in a similar vein, the Billion Trees program is a step in the right direction, but one that in part continues to expand the pine plantation industry, which erodes topsoil, thereby increasing drought and flood risk and polluting waterways. And we also know from the Canadian example that there's a real risk of them actually becoming net emitters. We have a zero carbon bill being enacted, but that is net zero carbon by 2050. That's 30 years away. And we can expect global average temperatures to be dramatically more than they are now. So as well as political responses, there have been some legal responses. And various governments around the world have and are being taken to court, including in New Zealand. In 2015, the Dutch government was successfully sued by a number of citizens and told to cut emissions. But nothing much has changed, and as usual with the justice system, the only winners are the lawyers. There is also a movement pushing internationally for the crime of ecocide, which are crimes against the living natural world. Except she died recently. It has potential, but time is not on our side. And yes, the person spearheading that is now dead, but it's going to be taken forward, I know. So aside from political and a legal response, what does a social response to our ecological and climate disaster really look like? And approaches to tackling community issues usually involve awareness raising, such as leafleting, lobbying, one-day marches, petitions. These make sense for smaller political issues, but we're long past that stage. And from social science and history, we have learned how to maximise our efforts to get governments to listen to us, and that is non-violent civil disobedience. Erica Chenoweth, who's Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and co-author of the book Why Civil Resistance Works, says, civil resistance allows people of all different levels of physical ability to participate, including the elderly, people with disabilities, children, and virtually anyone else who wants to. And if you think about it, everyone is born with an equal physical ability to resist non-violently. Anyone who has kids knows how hard it is to pick up a child who simply doesn't want to move, or to feed a child who simply doesn't want to eat. And here in Aotearoa, we have an incredible history of civil disobedience, beginning in 1881, with a non-violent resistance of several thousand Maoris against 1,600 troops when they marched on Parahaka. And this actually inspired Gandhi's movement of peaceful protest. They continuously ploughed the land that had been tried to be appropriated and built fences across roads, and it led to more than 400 Maori being jailed, where they remained under horrible conditions for as long as 16 months without trial. In the mid-1950s, the civil disobedience direct action campaigns of Martin Luther King and the American Black Civil Rights Movement brought about significant changes in policy through campaigns that involved several hundred people going to prison and several thousand arrests. The Freedom Riders went on buses into the southern parts of the US to break the bus segregation policy. Started with just 25 students, And by the end of the summer, 300 people were in prison. And that caused a fundamental change in policy. In addition to the revolutionary non-violent civil disobedience in Parahaka, we were the first country to give all women the right to vote. And the first to go nuclear free. But all these photos are black and white. And we're proud of civil disobedience once it's in history. But now we need it again, and we need it quickly. In World War II, the American economy was transformed in a matter of a few months to deal with the existential threat for its population that the war brought about. A World War II style mobilization, declaring us in a state of climate emergency and passing swift and transformative policies which reach everything, is necessary in order to minimize ecological catastrophe as well as to adapt to what's coming. So we know the problem. We know the political response is not fast enough. We know a legal response is not likely to be fast enough. We know civil disobedience works, and we know we can mobilize quickly. The missing piece is what we're actually going to do about it. And how does the climate crisis affect communities and places that we most deeply value? Most of us are motivated to be here not because we think we can save the planet. It might actually be too late for that, at least for humans. It's about doing the right thing. We can ask ourselves, what does it mean for me to be a good human? What does it mean to die without regrets? Will I be able to look my children in the eye and say, I did the best I could? And so Extinction Rebellion itself was born in the UK last year in October and has already made fantastic progress. It's about 400 cities around the world have declared climate emergency. So in October 2018, there was a declaration of rebellion. In November, 6,000 people blocked about 5 bridges, caused major disruption. And then, of course, we had the global international Week of Rebellion on the 15th of April, where London was basically shut down for 2 weeks. The movement is global. There are well over 300 groups in at least 30 plus countries, and there's more each week. And in New Zealand, we have at least 10 to 20, I think, groups. And just last week, I was in Amberley giving this talk, and they're setting up their group there. So Extinction Rebellion demands are: governments must tell the truth about the climate and the wider ecological emergency, must reverse inconsistent policies and work alongside the media to communicate the truth. It's not that they've been lying or hiding the truth, but they're just not telling the whole truth. It's not getting out there. Then number 2, the government must enact legally binding policy measures to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025 and reduce consumption levels. And then a National Citizens' Assembly to oversee the changes as part of creating a democracy fit for purpose. It's based on a system called sortition, which is a little like a jury system, and it's been used actually in Ireland and was used there to address the issues there of abortion and gay rights marriage. And it worked. So we are a non-violent network, and non-violence is the most effective way to bring about political change. And a regenerative culture is where you create a culture which is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. And XR focuses energy just not on direct actions, but also on support, capacity building, and fun. We face the climate and ecological crisis on a daily basis. And such a culture gives us the soul food that we do need. And it also practices our intention for the systems we want to develop at all levels of society going forward. And then we are based on autonomy and decentralisation. And in our own group, we have no set leader, and decision-making is distributed through self-organising teams. And we're on actions, it's generally the dog who's in charge. And one of the key aims of XR is to shift what's called the Overton window. And it's a bell curve of socially accepted public norms. And we look at the social norm of being environmentally friendly. Most people are vaguely aware that it's good to be environmentally friendly, but it doesn't actually influence their behaviour all that much. You have people on the left who actually intentionally damage the environment for some reason or another, usually money. And on the other end, you have people who are very active environmentalists. Now, according to the logic of positive psychology, when you tell people that the climate crisis is a crisis, what was expected to happen is this. People are supposedly feeling disempowered, hopeless, paralysed. And so they feel that they can make little difference to the situation, they will end up showing even less environmentally friendly behaviour. However, the hypothesis underlying Extinction Rebellion is this: that we expect that we will still find the majority of the population somewhere in the middle or slightly on their left. But there will be a significant minority of people that will feel much more motivated than before, because this is actually the most important issue out there. And they now see it as a moral obligation to protect what they believe in and what they value. They're called the upstanders. And they're willing to be involved, willing to get into civil disobedience, because they understand that big structural change is needed. So if you tell people that everything's going to be fine in the end, as long as they keep recycling, they will not be motivated to engage in dramatic sacrificial action. And it's not. It's a lie. It's a lie that everything is fine. Do you want the truth? I want to know what you can do about it. And these upstanders are actually all we need. And research into non-violent civil resistance concluded that you only need to mobilise about 1 to 3% of a population to bring about massive social change. Building on this, Roger Hallam, who's one of the founders of XR, and he's extensively researched effective radical campaign around the world, outlines some ways to maximise the impact even further. He says if it takes 1 million people on the street to get government to change, that is equivalent of only about 5,000 people getting arrested, or about 500 people getting jail sentences. And the elements that make non-violent direct action successful involve being respectful. And when people hear non-violence, they often think that it's limited just not hitting someone in the face. But it's actually treating the opponents with respect, whether that be people you are confronting or the police. Now, I know in the protests in London, a lot of the police got involved. You saw videos of them dancing. There was a lot of respect. There was chanting by the protesters saying, "We love the police." And there's a basic psychology that says people don't like to negotiate with people whom they don't like. Full stop. And we don't want any situations where things could escalate. We always have people nominated as de-escalators at any actions. It needs to be disruptive. And the problem with many protests is that they are very beautiful, but no one takes any notice because they can just walk away. It needs disruption to get attention of the media in a short period of time. And then it needs the attention of political decision makers. Also needs to be sacrificial. And that could be arresting, going to jail. And if you engage in sacrifice, people are more likely to be sympathetic with you. And you demonstrate just how serious you are about an issue. But that said, even for one person to go to jail, there needs to be a large number of support people doing other important jobs. And they're actually essential to our group working. And then backfiring, even if people don't really approve of your methods and aren't even really bothered about it, they will not approve of punishment that is perceived as unjust, cruel, or disproportionate. So after watching a version of this talk in November, a group began to meet every week. And in December, we decided to launch ourselves by declaring rebellion against ECAN. Turned off their water supply, blocked access to that valve for over 4 hours, and got great national media coverage. Got arrested. Got taken to the station, tapped on the wrist, said, "Don't do it again." But well done. So where are we at the moment? We've got 400 councils globally have declared a climate emergency. Here we are, 529. Thank you. The UK have now declared a climate emergency. The first country, but then they were the first country to start the Industrial Revolution and start emissions. Ireland has just declared a climate emergency. On the 16th of May, ECAN have a council meeting where on the agenda is a motion to declare a climate emergency. Also on the 16th of May, the Nelson Council are also meeting and are moving to declare. It'll be a race to see who's first. Tomorrow, we've got a film screening at ECAN, which is the BBC's David Attenborough Climate Change, The Facts. And then on the 24th of May, we've got an Earth strike with a student strike for climate. Now that is global. So the world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. So, thank you very much.
John.
Extinction Rebellion annoys me because it's very vague on actual policies. We should all get up and protest, but for what?
Well, we have got our demands.
Yes, but they are woolly and vague too.
So about vegans.
Yes,
Yes, well,
we're not policy makers. We just want them. They've got their own advisors. You know, governments have their own advisors, council have their own advisors. They know about these risks.
yes, well,
It's doing something about it. It's acknowledging it publicly and getting on and doing
my
something about it.
specific gripe against Extinction Rebellion is they're not advocating the single most effective personal change that any one of us can make to reduce the rate of CO2 emission. Apart from dying, you're quite right. and not having children. The next one is becoming vegan. Anyone in the room can do it tomorrow, and there is the long-term potential to reduce total global
National never agree.
global climate
It's one of the options.
emissions by
Yes.
28%
There is
for the next 100
a,
years.
yeah, there
So
is
go
a,
vegan, everybody, if you're serious
Yeah.
about climate change.
quite agree. It's vegetarian, veganism, they're actually quite close. Vegan is slightly better. But there's a whole organisation called Project Drawdown. And their organisation, it's a book, there's a website, has a whole list of things that are actually great to do individually. My personal one that I want to see is actually a carbon budget for everyone. Take the New Zealand emissions, divide it by the number of people, halve it. And that's your emissions. And you do what you want with it. You can eat meat, you can't drive, and you can't fly. You take personal control of what you're going to do about it. For me, I'm not having any kids. I never had kids, too late for me anyway. But I'm so glad I don't have any, frankly. And there is what's called a birth strike. Organisation has actually started. They don't want kids because it's really, really nasty that we can see in the future. And until something is actually seriously done about it, they will not have kids.
Yes, thank you for your talk, and you've just touched on what my question was going to be, because in your talk you mentioned nothing about population, and that is in fact the elephant.
It's slight elephant.
No, it's not.
It's not-
There are too many people on
There
the
are too many people on the world. However,
and
50% of the emissions
yeah,
are caused by 10% of the population.
yeah,
20% of people cause 70%, and that includes pretty much all of the first world, and that includes us.
yes, and
That's how lifestyle changes.
Those in the third world are rapidly trying to get into the second and the first world.
Yes, and they probably won't get a chance now.
Well, this is the thing. There are too many people on the planet.
Yep. But
And-
even if you halved the number of people, if you still had those 10% causing 50%, we're still on track for a climate crisis. So even if you halved it, yes, if we got down to a few 100,000, then we've got a chance. But the 7 billion, yes, I quite agree.
Kia ora, Jackie. Down the back. I'm not going to ask you about policy. I'm going to ask you to reconcile the idea of a climate emergency with the reality of democracy. Because it was great to see participatory democracy up there, but we in Christchurch have all lived under an emergency recently.
Yeah.
We've all lived under the reality of a minister with wartime powers. And look, I don't deny anything you're talking about. I'm absolutely behind you. I think we need climate action. I take personal action myself. I'm with you. I'm childless. I'm vegan. I ride my bike, all of that. But my personal change isn't going to make the difference. So we clearly need societal and political change. But states of emergency scare me.
Yep, and that's why we're asking for citizens' assembly. We do not want martial law. That is an absolute demand.
How do you work in with other organisations like 350.org?
Almost everyone in 350 is actually in Extinction Rebellion. We actually started from a 350 film night, and that's where we got. I was in 350, well, still am, and we just all migrated into Extinction Rebellion. Student School Strike for Climate, we work with them closely. There are there are a number of organisations. Yes, AWA. We all support each other's actions. We turn up for the water protests, etc., etc. We're trying.
I don't have a question. I do have a comment, and that is I saw a wonderful documentary about Greenland, and a good university expedition camped on the top of the ice cap, and it is losing 7 meters a year of ice. And what impressed me and made me on the verge of despair was that it's caused largely by smut, black carbon falling on the ice, it just burns and is dissolved in the ice cap at an incredible rate, and that makes me even sadder than the loss of my trout fishing waters.
Yeah. What it actually does is the black actually absorbs the heat as well,
Yes.
so it disguises the white reflecting.
Hi, Jackie. You seem to suggest that. Just put it in the email.
Turn it on. It's an Irish one.
Casual resident. You seem to suggest that
The Irish space
the outcome was almost inevitable, and I'm not necessarily disputing that. Should we put our efforts into adaptation rather than trying to stop it at this stage?
Both. Emissions, the CO2 levels, the greenhouse gas levels are caused by humans. Now there are some tipping points that are getting really, really close and really bad. And if those happen, then there's nothing we can do about it. But we have everything to play for still. If we don't do anything, then we're on a course for nasty, 3 to 6 degrees, and that's just by the end of the century. It's not likely to stop there due to tipping points, due to feedback loops. But if we do something, then we can influence things. It's caused by humans. So if humans do something, something's going to happen. And it's on an individual scale, but it's also on a massive other scale as well. Industry, etc. We need to bring the fossil fuel industry into boot. They have basically lied to us. They've known about this since the 1960s. And they covered it up like the tobacco industry for years. But if we do something, we have a possibility of achieving something. And I just think, yes, we can adapt, but are we actually going to do something to actually reduce our own emissions? I look at my emissions and I think I'm not flying. And I think every single emission that I give out, what is going to be the consequence of that? How many homes are going to be lost because of that? How many Bangladeshis are going to die because of the carbon that I emit? In concrete, 1 tonne of concrete, 1.2.5 tonnes of CO2.
Jackie, thank you very much for finally standing up and joining others, and please pass on at least the support of some of the people in the room for what Extinction Rebellion are finally doing. I have a comment and I have a question. I've been worrying about this issue for more than 30 years, since that report came out in 1990 by the UN that we had to limit the temperature rise to 1 degree. At that time I was still optimistic because they were having the huge Earth Summit in Rio, where all the leaders from the world were going to come and address environmental and development issues, and it came to nothing. And that back then India and China had not developed. People were saying, what will happen when there are 1 billion rich people in India and China and they all want the American lifestyle? And we're seeing that happening today. Population is not the issue. There were 1 billion people when my grandmother was born. There are nearly 8 now, but it will stabilise at about 10 billion people. It's how much we consume. We're consuming 100 times more than when my grandmother was born and the motor vehicle had not even been invented. The thing that is starting to fill me with a tiny grain of optimism that not perhaps in my lifetime, but perhaps in my children or grandchildren's lifetime, things can be turned around, is because there is this growing political will, and it took a 15-year-old Swedish girl to stand up and start the movement and get the kids mobilised.
Goddess Greta.
But yesterday, I think many people would have heard in the media, Cambridge University, that is well known around the world, said that they were going to start a centre for climate repair. Now, I have long been against geoengineering and this kind of approach. I think we all have to do all those other things, get on the bike, reduce meat consumption if you can't become a vegan or a vegetarian, etc., etc. But I had almost given up hope that we had gone, you know, I didn't believe we had 12 years. I thought we'd already passed the point of no return. But a centre like Climate Repair can also buy us time. Yes, we can plant trees. Yes, we can store a lot of carbon in the soil. Yeah, there are a lot of things we can do. But the great thing is, seawater freezes at -2 degrees. Freshwater freezes at 0. It is possible. We make snow. If the $5 trillion that is subsidising fossil fuel around the world started to be redirected to serious attempts to build that snowfield up in the Arctic, because the ice sheet's very thin, there are technical things that we can also do. My question is, where does Extinction Rebellion stand on those sort of technological in conjunction with personal and governmental and policy changes in terms of addressing the issue? I'm sorry for hogging the mic.
Geoengineering.
Gary.
It's a real gamble. I'm not too sure that they have a particular policy on it. I know a lot of scientists don't like it. I personally don't like it, but we may be forced to do it. If we come up against a tipping point where things start to happen. And I think probably our first crucial point will be food. And if we come across the 2010 heat wave that Russia had, where they closed their borders to grain coming out, which caused the Arab Spring, and at the same time we have another polar vortex and we have another load of flooding through the US that's going to reduce their grain. Australia is already losing its grain growing capacity. It's going to be too hot there to grow at some point in the near future. Once that happens, it'll be food that'll be the problem. My only hope is that at that point, people will actually really wake up and really look at their lifestyles and think, no, we can't do this anymore. The only other thing that I can see that is going to force people is there will be another global financial crisis, probably within the next year. At that point, emissions will reduce because they did last time. And I suspect this time it'll be harder and more extreme.
I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Gary more personally for stopping emissions in Christchurch for turning down the Northern Arterial 30 years ago. And it is back on the table right now, so I just would like to invite you all along to another rebellion that is being planned by a few people. We just started it yesterday, but outside the Christchurch City Council building on the Wednesday the 22nd of what month are we? May, at 11:30 a.m. we are going to protest the City Council who are planning planning a road that is putting cars before people in the world we're living in today.
I'm going to come again.
Yes, you better.
Other people have before, Gary.
Are people happy at the moment? But we're running out of time. We've got a few more comments and then we'll finish.
Delirious. Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Peter.
And also just again to sort of, this was 2 years ago, mind you, but there was a really good moment that we had here when Johan Rockström, who runs the Stockholm Resilience Institute and Centre, came to New Zealand, and he said in front of an audience, effectively, yes, the danger and the potential catastrophe has never been higher in the world we live in and that we know, but there's also never been greater reason and opportunity to be hopeful. And I take your point about essentially saying let's not hope, let's actually just stand up and bloody well do something. But I just want to sort of take a census of the room. Could you please raise your hand if you own or are a director of a business? Can you please, and keep your hands up, folks. Can you please also raise your hand if you sit on a board of directors? Keep your hands raised. Keep your hands raised. All right, now, just of everyone who's here, have you and your organization done an audit of your carbon emissions?
Yep.
You have?
Yes.
Now, for everyone who has not, please fucking do it.
Apart from fake opponents like Donald Trump and things, but I'm just interested if you could enlighten me and perhaps others in the room that aren't so sure. What is it? What are the rational arguments by the scientists who deny climate change? What do they? What do they actually say?
There are no actual rational.
No, but what they claim to be
Rationale.
rational.
Yeah, obviously we know that pretty much all of them are actually funded by the fossil fuel industry. Their rationales are very, very leaky. They mainly actually base their claims actually on emotions. They don't actually base it on any science as such.
So how do they do that? Because they'd be challenged immediately.
Yeah, they are challenged. But it's just constant pushing.
Kia ora, Jackie. Thank you for your wonderful kōrero here to us tonight. That was pretty amazing. And thanks for the call to action there with our audit, There's also a friend of mine in Wellington. They've started a group called Consumer Addicts. And they're examining their addictions and what they're addicted to. Or consumption addicts. So I thought that might be a note to end on. Thank you, Gary.
Absolutely. It is that consumption. Stop buying crap.
You've got a meeting with ECAN Council on Thursday.
Yes.
Here in Christchurch, they're seen as a pretty useless organisation, bogged down with their own dogma. Would it be useful if we organised a few people to try and disrupt the meeting?
Yes! We will be there outside. They are not allowing actually anyone inside, funnily enough.
What time?
Oh, no. Excellent. Thank you, Julie.
Just to answer that, because I checked with ECAN, because they legally can't. So under the fire regulations, the room has a limit of 65, and they're looking at how they might get around the fire regulations if more than 65 of us turn up. So we can. It's at 11 a.m. If you turn up a little bit before 11 a.m. so we can get ourselves organised, and we aim to show ECAN that this matters to lots and lots of ordinary Christchurch people and extraordinary ones as well.
Turn up with bells on it.
Yeah, just if you're wanting to do that audit with your business, there's a company called EKOS, EKOS. They're very good. They can do that audit with you and give you all the figures. And the other thing, just to finish, I wanted to say was, don't think that that in order to be part of Extinction Rebellion, you have to be willing to be arrested, because that might have been the message that has come across. So there's at the moment about 250 of us, and there's probably only about 8 to 10 people that are willing to get arrested, and that's enough. And the rest of us do all sorts of useful and interesting things. We turn up at the actions, we do stuff in the background, but you don't have to be prepared to be arrested, and you also don't have to be prepared to be interviewed by the media. We have a whole team of people who are our media spokespeople who want to learn that. So
That's May 24th actually.
May 24th will be part of that global strike. And also the Christchurch City Council is also getting very close to declaring due to pressure that Extinction Rebellion is putting on.
Excellent. Right. And I just before I thank Jackie, I saw an old Ngāi Tahu mate of mine yesterday, and I said, was he going mutton birding this year? And he said no, because he said, since I've known you, and I think we've known each other for 10 years, but it's about that. He said the bird numbers have dropped by 70%. And he said that's plastic. and the ocean.
Wow.
And so that's something that I just heard yesterday. But look, I'm sure you'll join with me in thanking Jackie for an enlightening, depressing, suicidal.
I'm known as doom and gloom.
Yes, I know. But it does. You know, you go away from this and you think, what do I do? And I think that's the point several people have been saying. And maybe that's something that Tuesday Club needs to actually start a series on. We've got a number of series. What can we do? And I think that's really important. So join with me in thanking Jackie.
And you can join Extinction Rebellion.
Well
Start
done,
signing
Jackie.
up.
This is our longest session ever.